The first thing I heard was the dog screaming. Not barking, nor howling, but a high, tearing sound that did not belong in any jungle. The air turned cold, as if the night had drawn a breath. Leaves shivered without wind. Something heavy brushed the tent canvas above my head. When I stepped out, lantern raised, I saw the footprints around the fire, bare, three-toed, and standing in my own. Men have asked me to recount this, say it might do some good for others who venture where they do not belong. If you are inclined, lend this old tale your notice, mark your approval, speak your thoughts below, and keep company with such accounts. It began 3 weeks earlier, when I still believed the world was entirely knowable. It was the 6th of May, 1916, upon the island of Malakula in the New Hebrides, what is now called Vanuatu. I had come out from Port Vila with a survey party in the employ of a copra firm, charged with marking boundaries for an inland plantation above Banban Bay. My name scarcely matters now. I was 28 years of age then, full of certitude, with a brass compass, a prismatic theodolite, and a head crowded with European notions of order. There were 4 of us Europeans in the party. Mercer, a Scots overseer with a temper like quicklime. Holloway, a younger clerk from Sydney, pale and eager, who kept a notebook and quoted Stevenson. And old Sergeant Wilkes, Royal Engineers retired, whose right leg had a Boer bullet somewhere in the bone. Alongside us were 12 island labourers from Efate and Tanna, and 2 guides from a village near Lakatoro, men of Malakula itself. We made camp first near the coast, in the sago palms. On that evening, we shared tobacco around a small fire. Mercer rolled his own from a tin, licking the paper with slow care. Holloway spoke of his wife in Parramatta, expecting their first child. He had a faded photograph of her, which he passed to me as if it were some fragile relic. Wilkes told us, instead of the Sudan, of the hot dust above the Nile. The labourers watched us talk, amused, chattering softly among themselves in Bislama and their own tongues. It was then that one of the Malakula men, a tall fellow named Naru, asked me, very politely, whether we intended to go beyond the river inland. "That is where the survey takes us," I replied. "Why do you ask, friend?" He hesitated, his eyes on the darkness beyond our fire. "Up there," he said at last, touching his throat with 2 fingers. "Abere I stap. No good fella place." I had heard the word Abere already in Vila, half in jest, half in warning. A female devil, they said, who kept to the deep places, alluring and cruel. I smiled and poured him a little more rum. "Devils fear a straight line and a clear map," I told him. The men laughed politely, but Naru did not. Had I understood his silence properly that night, I might have insisted we turn our faces elsewhere. We pushed inland on the 8th. The jungle closed about us, heavy and shining after the rains. The sound of it was unceasing. Insects like rattles, unseen birds chuckling in the canopy, the susurrus of palms. I marked bearings, took sightings with the theodolite, and cut markers into trees with Wilkes at my side. Now and then, I heard the labourers speaking low about Abere. I affected not to listen. The first oddity came upon us on the 2nd day. We had reached a narrow, stony creek that fed into the big river Namble. Along one bank, in a stretch of soft mud, we discovered tracks. At first, I took them for those of some large bird, for they were 3-toed, about the span of a man's hand and pressed deep. Yet they did not move in a straight line as any bird would, but in a staggered, almost human fashion, one set following the other, as if made by 2 feet. I knelt and measured with my tape. The stride was near to a yard. The toes were long, splayed, with a backward spur like that of a fighting cock, only much broader. The labourers would not come near. "It is some cassowary," Holloway said, though I had never heard of cassowary upon Malekula. Wilkes grunted and scratched his beard. "Whatever it is," he muttered. It walked upright like a man. We followed the tracks a short distance, but they simply ceased upon a patch of gravel where nothing held an impression. I told myself that the stones had taken them, or that we had lost the line. Yet there was a feeling then, a little stirring at the base of my skull, like the first chill before fever. That night, the jungle seemed louder. The cicadas shrilled endlessly, and some enormous fruit bat passed over the camp with wings like the sails of a cutter. Mercer cursed the damp that crept into his boots and vowed we would finish the line in half the allotted time. To demonstrate his resolve, he made the men work an hour past sunset, slashing vine and undergrowth in the dying light. It was during that extra hour that the second sign came. We had hung kerosene lanterns in the trees and thin yellow islands in a rising mist. I was marking a tree with red paint when I realized I no longer heard the usual chorus. The insects were silent, the birds too. Only our own movement sounded, our own respiration. "Cursed relief," Mercer said, but his voice carried too loudly in that sudden hush. It felt as though the air had thickened, waiting for some acknowledgement. Then, from somewhere ahead in the dimness, there came a sound. "Wilkes," a voice called in English, clear and sharp. "Wilkes, here!" It was Holloway's voice. It was exact in tone and pitch, but it came from entirely the wrong direction, from the uncut bush beyond our lamps, where he could not possibly have been. A moment later, the real Holloway called out for a fresh pencil from behind me, in camp. Wilkes straightened slowly, every joint in him stiff. "You heard that," he said to me. "A trick of echo," I replied. "These valleys make a mockery of distance." That explained it sufficiently for me in the moment, and sufficiently for Mercer, who barked that we were to pack up the tools and return to the fire. Yet I saw the Malekula men exchange glances and touch their throats as Naru had done, 2 fingers lightly placed. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated in different guises. Once it was the rattle of the chain measure where none of us worked. Once it was the low, tuneless whistle that Wilkes habitually employed, coming from somewhere behind us, while the old soldier stood in plain view. Each time we attempted to argue it away with wind, with echo, with our own fatigue. On the 10th, we reached a ridge above the Namble, from which we could see, between gaps in the trees, a shining band of water coiling below. The air was close and hot. I remember clearly that my shirt clung to me, and my handkerchief was half black with the ink of my own sweat. We chose a small rise for camp, as any military man would, with some pride in our prudence. There came then a change that I still struggle to describe. One moment, the afternoon light lay upon the leaves, a bright spilling green. The next, without cloud, without any visible cause, the light dulled. Not as if the sun had gone, but as if some colour had been drawn from the world. The men noticed it at once. Their voices lowered. Even Mercer fell silent for a time. The dogs, 2 wiry curs we had taken on at Lakatoro, ceased their sniffing and sat by the fire pit, staring toward the eastern slope. Their ears pricked, but they did not growl. They did not even whine. They simply listened. It was in that greyed air that we found the torn pack. Holloway had set his canvas rucksack upon a tree root while he copied a bearing. When he turned again, scarcely 10 minutes later, it lay a little way off, as if it had been dragged. The stout canvas was ripped in 2 long, parallel slashes, each the length of my forearm. The tin mug that had been strapped to its side was flattened, as if driven over by a dray. Nothing else was disturbed. The ground bare around it showed no sign of passage, no overturned leaves, no impression. It might be a pig, I ventured, though there was nothing of bristle nor hoof. A pig that walks on tiptoe and knows to leave the theodolite untouched, Wilkes answered. The old soldier's humour had grown dry and spare by then. His eyes, once cheerfully appraising, I took frequent stocks of the tree line. My rational mind still held fast. I wrote in my own field book that night, local superstition working upon tired men, need rest, need firmer discipline, yet my sleep was poor. I woke twice to the same dream of walking in thick fog while someone, some woman, walked ahead just out of sight, talking softly in a language I almost understood. The micro shock that truly unsettled us came upon the 13th day, almost at our exact midpoint inland. We had set a small transit along the edge of a narrow ravine. A thin vapour clung to the bottom like breath against glass, though the day above was clear. "Quick work, lads," Mercer urged. "Then we shall all have a dram." I bent to note my reading when the transit, a sturdy brass instrument on its tripod, jumped beneath my hands. Not a little nudge, and not the quiver of unsteady ground, but a sharp jerk, as though someone had struck one of its legs with a boot. The whole frame slid half an inch in the soil. "Steady there," Wilkes snapped. He was 3 paces away. No one else stood near. Before I could speak, the world below us vanished. The vapour in the ravine rose in a single motion, like steam from an opened engine, engulfing us to the waist in cold white. My teeth clacked together with the sudden chill. For a breath or two, I could not see my own boots. The smell of it was wrong. Not clean mist, not rain, but something faintly sweet and corrupt, like flowers left too long upon a grave. Through that blind whiteness, very close to my left ear, came a whisper in Bislama, in a woman's voice, light and intimate. "You come, man," it said. "You come. Come, man. Come." I flung out my hand and touched only empty air. Then, as swiftly as it had risen, the vapour thinned and drew away into the ravine. The warmth returned with an almost audible click. Mercer cursed and demanded to know who had played fool. When none answered, he flew into one of his rages, threatening to dock pay to send men back to Vila. The Malakula guides, however, gathered their few belongings at once. "We go now," Naru said quietly to me. "Plenty signed finis here." "Abere smell you," I argued. I spoke of contracts, of pay, of obligation. He listened with patience, learned perhaps from generations of such conversations. "Man from Vila," he said at last. "You know here good. She call you same you mother call." He touched his throat with 2 fingers and walked away into the trees, his companion following. They did not look back. Their departure marked the beginning of our true isolation, though at the time Mercer insisted we could manage with our knowledge and the existing labourers. His authority still weighed heavily. We pressed on, but the jungle grew increasingly strange. Birds startled at our passage and flew not away from us but toward the interior, as if fleeing some pressure behind. The usual stink of rot and blossom was broken at intervals by a distinct musky odour, unfamiliar, which appeared and faded as if we stepped through invisible bands of air. More than once, my skin pebbled with cold, while the sweat still stood on my brow. Nights became a kind of siege. The calls began just before midnight. Sometimes it was my own voice, or so it seemed, calling softly from beyond the tents. Sometimes it was the voice of one of the laborers, repeating a single word in his own tongue. Once, I heard my father, dead many years, say my name from somewhere beyond the dead embers. Each time, the dogs heard it too. They would lift their heads, stare in the direction of the sound, and tremble, their teeth chattering faintly. They never barked. They did not go toward it, nor away. They simply quaked upon their bellies like small boats in a sudden swell. By then, even Mercer had fallen quiet. He no longer worked the men past the light. On the 17th, he took me aside while we checked our compasses. "How far to finish this line in truth?" he asked. 3, perhaps 4 days, at our present rate," I answered. "We shall not stay more than 2, he said, meeting my eyes. "We shall declare the rest impassable if need be. The firm may curse, but they are welcome to cut their own path." I agreed too readily. That secret relief troubled me later. The night of the 19th brought our peak encounter, which has marked every day of my life since. The air had been close all afternoon. There was a stillness even before dusk, a sense of waiting. The men walked with their shoulders tightened, glancing often to the south where the land dipped away. We made camp near a narrow gully, for the ground was marginally drier there. As a concession to our unease, Wilkes set his rifle within easy reach, and Mercer authorized a double thickness of firewood. After dark, the calls began earlier than usual, while we still talked low about home. Holloway had been speaking of his expected child again, wondering aloud if he would resemble the photograph of his wife. "He will have her eyes, God willing," Wilkes said. He was oiling the bolt of his rifle with small, economical motions. Best a boy resemble his mother, and not an old soldier. I was about to remark that this was sentimentality from an unlikely quarter when everything became still once more. This time, there was no fading of sound. It ceased as if smitten. The fire gave a small hiss as a log shifted, but the crackle of it seemed very loud. The dogs rose in unison, noses high, ears forward. The hair along their spines stood up like bristles on a brush. Then, from just beyond the circle of firelight, came a woman's laugh. It was low and soft, almost musical. There was nothing hysterical in it, nothing monstrous. It might have come from a veranda in Vila or a salon in Sydney, yet it came from a place where no woman stood. In a jungle where we 4 Europeans were the only such creatures of our sex. One of the laborers cried out and flung his tin plate into the fire. Sparks leapt up, revealing for an instant the trunks of the trees around us, all smooth and empty. "Who is there?" Mercer called. His voice wavered on the last word. The laugh came again, a little nearer, and then, very clearly, in English. "Wilkes, here." The old soldier swore softly. The dogs backed away, not from the tree line, but from a point just behind my right shoulder, where the air seemed to bend. In that moment, driven perhaps by a terror that had curdled at last past endurance, I did something reckless. I stepped away from the fire, lantern held high, and addressed the unseen thing in the same tone I might have used with an obstinate director of the firm. "We mean no offense here," I said. "We wish only to pass and mark our lines." It answered in Bislama, half mirth, half scorn. "Line no save you," it said. light no save you. The lantern flame bent as if drawn aside by wind. A cold struck through me from neck to heel. My breath plumed in a visible cloud, though the night itself remained heavy and warm on my hands and face. Then I saw her. Not clearly, not as I might see you across a table. She stood, or seemed to stand, between two trees at the edge of the fire's reach. There was the suggestion of a woman's shape, tall and slender, hair hanging wetly down. Her skin, if skin it was, appeared pale in that dimness, but not like the pallor of our own kind. It had a faint greenish cast, as though lit from within by some distant drowned light. Her eyes, if eyes they were, as shone not with reflection from the fire, but with their own cold gleam, colourless like water seen at depth. Her feet, so far as I could discern, ended not in toes, but in those same 3 splayed points I had seen in the mud by the creek. I do not know how long we stared at one another. Time became as fog. Behind me, I heard someone praying in a tongue I did not know, and someone else sobbing quietly. My own thoughts had narrowed to a single thread. Mark what you see, for no one will believe it. Then I felt a touch upon my wrist, just where one might take a pulse. It was the lightest pressure, as of cool fingers laid there. "You come," the voice said, this time within my skull rather than in the air. "You leave Whitefalla, you come." I confess that for a moment the thought of obeying felt as simple and natural as stepping out of the sun. There was an ease promised, a cessation of all this dread. Some other life opened just beyond the trees. What broke it was not any great courage of mine, but the sound of Holloway sobbing my name like a child. "Do not go," he said. "Please, please do not go." That plea, spoken in the cracked voice of a man who had not yet seen his own child, brought me back to myself. I tore my arm away from that unseen grip and stumbled backward. At once, the cold slackened. The figure between the trees seemed to thin, to lose coherence, as though she dissolved into the darkness. The last I saw of her, if see it was one hand, long-fingered and webbed, raised to her own throat, 2 digits pressed lightly there, in the same unhurried gesture Naru had shown. Then she was gone. The jungle sounds returned in a rush so sudden that I clapped my hands to my ears. The dogs fell whimpering to their bellies. Mercer ordered double watch, but no man slept, not truly, that night. We broke camp before dawn and began our retreat without consultation. No order was given. It was simply understood. Even Mercer offered no argument. His only words as we doused the fire were, "The line is complete enough." The journey back toward the coast was no simple escape. Twice we found our old blazes upon trees altered, as if bitten at by some great animal, the gouges widened and frayed. Once we came upon one of our survey stakes torn from the earth and split neatly down its length, as one might split a length of cane, though the grain of the hardwood should have denied such a division. On the second day of retreat, one of the labourers fled in the night. We discovered his absence at dawn, as along with his prints leading away from the camp, set one after the other in a straight line. After 20 yards, a second set of impressions joined them, 3-toed and deep. 10 yards beyond that, all prints ceased, as if both had taken wing. We did not speak of it. The dogs did not live to see the coast. They refused food and water, staring always toward the south, ribs showing, their paws raw. On the last night inland, they crept together to the very center of the camp, laid their heads across each other's flanks, and simply lay still. Their bodies were cool by morning, yet there was no mark upon them. Holloway wept openly as we buried them beneath a strangler fig. We reached Lakatoro, gaunt and hollow-eyed. The villagers watched us arrive in silence. No laughter now, no jovial bargaining. The news of Naru's failure to return had reached them ahead of us. An old woman spat once in the dust before my boots, not in contempt, but as if to lay some barrier. A child touched his own throat and fled indoors. From Lakatoro, we took passage by launch to Vila. During that journey, the sea looked ordinary, blue and indifferent. But at night, I woke twice thinking I heard that same voice under the slap of the waves against the hull, calling me in Bislama and in my mother's tongue by turns. In Port Vila, our report met with a practiced disbelief. The resident commissioner received us in his office, shirt sleeves rolled, pipe clamped in his teeth. Mercer presented the map with its incomplete inland line and spoke of impassable ravines, of hostile natives, of fever among the party. He did not speak of the woman in the trees, neither did I. We allowed the silence between the words to swallow such things. When it came my turn to submit written notes, I too set down only what might pass the civilized eye. I described unusual tracks without implication. I mentioned a transient fog in a ravine, an odor unaccounted for, the strange illness of the dogs. Nowhere did I write Abere. Nowhere did I say devil. An official account later appeared in a small colonial paper, speaking of hazardous terrain and the bravery of survey men. It made mention of a regrettable disappearance among our native guides, attributed to desertion. It did not say that the jungle had opened and taken one of its own back. What I know, or rather what I believe in the quietest hours, remained unwritten. Years passed. The war in Europe swallowed many names. Holloway returned to Sydney and, as I learned by letter, met his son. Mercer went on to other plantations, his temper unchanged, but he never again led a survey inland upon Malakula. Wilkes died of an apoplexy in 23, found sitting upright in his chair with his boots polished and his hands folded upon his stick, as if he had merely paused mid-march. As for myself, I attempted to lay Malakula aside. I told myself that exhaustion, fever, and local tales had worked upon us all. Yet the jungle had entered me in some fashion that no doctor's draught could purge. Twice in the decade that followed, I met surviving members of our party in unexpected places, and each time the past rose up with undiminished force. The first was in Sydney, in a boarding house near Circular Quay in 1921. I recognized one of the effete labourers by the scar above his eye, though his hair had greyed. We greeted each other stiffly at first, as men separated by class and distance will, but over a shared bottle his reserve softened. "Waitafala, remember Abere?" he asked at last. "I remember something," I answered. He nodded slowly, as if this was all that could reasonably be expected. "Me? No go bush night long time," he said. "Suppose moon big, still she can see you." The second encounter came in Vila itself, in 28, when I returned on unrelated business. A much younger clerk in the administration, who had not been there in 16, asked lightly over dinner whether I had ever heard the old stories of water devils up on Malakula. Before I knew it, my hands were shaking so violently that the wine slopped from my glass. Certain triggers remain with me even now. If fog rises suddenly from a river, I find myself holding my breath involuntarily. and waiting for the air to grow cold within the warmth. The call of certain birds at dusk, when they make that strange chattering laughter deep in the trees, can send my thoughts at once back to that woman's soft amusement at our fire. On more than one occasion, alone in my rooms in Melbourne where I eventually settled, I have woken in the dark to hear my own name spoken clearly beside the bed, in a woman's voice that is not quite any I have known. The curtains will be still, the street beyond silent, my own breath loud. Once, emboldened or perhaps maddened by repeated nights of such visitation, I attempted a kind of investigation. I wrote to a missionary upon Malakula, a man I had met briefly in Vila, asking in neutral terms about local beliefs concerning water spirits. His reply came months later, short and strained. "These matters," he wrote, "do not profit white men to ponder. The people say there are older tenants of this island than themselves. They make their offerings and keep away. Perhaps you also should keep away, even in thought. That advice I have not entirely managed to follow. For all my education, for all my instruments and charts, the memory of that hand upon my wrist remains more vivid than many of the so-called solid facts of my career. What else in this world walks beside us, unmeasured, unseen, until some ill chance brings our paths together? I live now a quieter life, yet small things still draw me back. The smell when flowers begin to rot in a vase, sweet and wrong. The way mist gathers sometimes in the hollows of a park while the surrounding streets remain clear. The sight of a child pressing 2 fingers lightly to his own throat in jest, and not knowing he makes an old island sign. It is not that I seek to explain what we met. Explanation would shrink it into something that would no longer resemble the thing itself. Rather, I have come to accept that some corners of the map resist the line, not because they are empty, but because they are already spoken for. In the end, what haunts me most is not the voice, nor the chill, nor even that pale shape between the trees. It is a lesser detail, almost trivial. When I recall that night with precision, I see again the circle of earth where our fire sat, bare and trodden. Just at the edge of that circle, where darkness began, there is the faintest mark, half overlaid by boot prints and dog tracks. It is the impression of 3 long toes and a backward spur, pressed once into the soft earth, pointing inward, as if something had stood there for a long while before we ever noticed.